Hi everyone, and welcome to today's GG&A webinar on making the most of contact reports. I'm Lana Buseman from the marketing team here at GG&A, and we're very excited for you to join us. Before we begin today, I just want to go over some technical details. We ask that you please log into WebEx before dialing in. Once you launch the webinar, a window will appear on your screen similar to what you see on slide 1. If you've already called in, please hang up and follow the instructions in the window to dial in. That way we can associate your phone with your name. During the session, your phone will be muted. However, we may ask some yes or no questions during the presentation. Please look at the slide on the screen to see where you can answer yes or no or use the raise your hand feature. We also encourage you to use the chat panel shown on slide 3 in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen for any questions or comments during the session. Please notice that we ask you to direct your question to all panelists so that the presenter and I can see it and field it. At the end of today's session, we're going to ask you to take a 1-minute survey to let us know what you thought of the webinar, so please stick around for that. If at any point during the webinar you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please send me an email at lbuseman@grensclear.com or call our meeting provider, WebEx, directly at 866-229-3239. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, everybody, for taking some time to join us today to talk about the very exciting topic of contact reports. We were a bit surprised at the level of interest in registrations for this particular topic, given that many of the things we present in GG&A's webinar series include lofty subjects and trends in fundraising and philanthropy. And something as mundane as contact reports turns out to hit some form of spot, be it sweet or sour, I'm not sure yet, but it's clear that it is the type of topic that is something that's necessary in our everyday use of donor management systems, in planning for future fundraising activities, evaluating staff performance, and just being as effective as we can be as fundraisers in our business. So the idea of trying to make contact reports an entertaining subject for 45 minutes is something of a challenge, but it sure helps when you've got the great content of truly terrible contact reports that I've had the pleasure of reading over time, some of which I'll show you some examples of today. But the real takeaway that I hope to leave you with is really some templates and some guidance on why do we do contact reports, what is the kind of information that we're trying to get out of interactions with our prospects and constituents, so that we can use this really fabulous tool for collecting information as something that is not just an administrative requirement that allows us to get reimbursed for travel expenses, but is actually something that's strategic and thoughtful. My role at GG&A is really probably falls under one broad umbrella, which is how can we get information to be more effective fundraisers, and how can we organize it and understand it in ways that allow us to be more strategic in our thinking. A lot of data collection really follows the theme of this cartoon. Just collect it, and then someone will go through and sort it out. Most of what we think about in terms of data collection usually ends up being really fancy stuff. It's predictive analytics and list matching and all the things we read about big data and using constituent relationship management software as ways to understand these big data trends. And what it comes down to is some of the best information that we get, probably most of the best information we get is you sitting across the table from someone who's interested in what you have to say, and the interactions that go back and forth. This has extensive research applications for gift capacity estimates, understanding interest areas, and then it has even more important applications for our strategic planning purposes. How do we understand what a prospect's interested in? At what level might they support us? What do they care about in all these different ways? Martin Grenzebach, Lear and Associates, said this offhandedly once. It wasn't one of those applause lines in a speech or something like that, but I think it's just great. You will learn more in a 20-minute meeting with a prospect than you will from any amount of research. Prospect research will tell you where to spend the 20 minutes. And I think it really encapsulates the importance of the face-to-face meeting, of reading body language, being able to present your side of the case and listening carefully at the interests that prospects share with you, or in some cases, the disinterest that they may share with you. And then how can we use all of the data that can be collected from other sources, the things that are already in your database, the wealth screenings, the Google searches, all of the detailed high-level prospect analysis to make decisions around the fact that you may have tens or hundreds of thousands of potential people to talk to, depending on your organization. But we can't possibly see all of them. And even if we were to crowd them all into the football stadium, we still couldn't get that 20 minutes of information from every one of them. So once we've gotten to the point of deciding we want to see somebody, the contact report becomes the basis for understanding what happened in that interaction. So the potential value of a contact report, which is different than its actual value, in some cases at least, they come from contacts. We've had a chance for development staff in the field to conduct field research. They've had an opportunity to sit down with a person who's been willing to take that meeting, and we can start we don't even have to necessarily understand what they were talking about, but we can start to think about what it means. Where did they start to describe parts of the program that are meaningful to them? What are their emotional connections to you? What are their research interests and the other types of charities that they may support, which may give you an indicator of your competition as well as their interest? The fact that they took a meeting at all and why. In some cases, you walk in the door, if you're a frontline gift officer, you've no doubt experienced this, they took the meeting to tell you how upset they are with you. In most cases, they took the meeting because they really want to hear from you and they really want to share their feelings about your organization with you. A word stolen from the research shop at a client of ours, visual bling and audio bling. What did you see that gives you some indication of their capacity? You can get an understanding of their house, of their artwork, of the way they dress, anything that gives you some sense of, again, both interest and capability. And audio bling being, what did they say? What dropping of information did they do that gives you a sense of where this person fits in the social pantheon and the economic pantheon? And most importantly, what do they care about? This is a chance to listen and have people tell you face-to-face while reading their body language what gets them going, why they want to support an organization and what it would take. You try to think about the amount of information that is available under these kinds of circumstances. If you're a big development office with 50 gift officers and they manage 90 visits apiece, which is right in the middle of what we see in terms of big shops doing visits, that'll work out to 5,000 hours or more of what would be transcripts if we were recording these conversations, which I don't recommend, by the way. That's what contact reports are for. And again, if you think about the volume of information contained in 5,000 hours per year of interviews, which is really what a face-to-face contact is, it's almost mind-boggling how much information we can collect, and then we have to think about how do we record it and use it. And yet, getting any record of a contact is a chore. So even if you're good at it, even if most visits are actually entered into your system and you can say these gift officers did these visits on these dates, most people don't like doing that. I've heard it compared to doing the dishes. It's necessary, but it's not exactly fun. And then, of course, we've got many circumstances of people telling you most of it's just not entered. It's in a notebook or it's in somebody's head that the visit went really well, but that's all we get. even if we get a contact report, it often contains what amounts to nonsense. It may be professional nonsense, and again, I'm going to show you some examples in a few minutes, but it's information that we can't use. It doesn't do anything to help us understand how we're going to move toward a gift. Getting anybody to go back and read and make use of a contact report is a chore, largely because they're either not there or they don't contain a lot of information. But that becomes a critical feature that I want to talk about in the webinar today, which is people aren't going to enter contact reports if they don't think they're being used for any useful purpose. So we have to tackle a couple of obstacles. One is certainly getting good contact reports with useful information entered into an accessible system, but this isn't really an advancement services problem. This is really a management issue of saying we need to collect this data to make decisions, to help you be a better fundraiser, to help identify problems before they become insurmountable, to help you take the information you have and bring in the team or the resources necessary for you to be successful. The fact is, thousands upon thousands of prospects are interviewed by development staff in any organization in any year if you're at a certain size, certainly a sizable percentage of your prospects in any given environment. And if we can't record that and we can't go back and look at it and we don't make conscious decisions to review it, that data is just lost. It was a nice conversation. It may have helped you further your relationship with a prospect, but it doesn't allow us to do anything more strategic than that. So for my next gig, my plan is to publish a coffee table book. I've already taken the liberty of designing the cover, and it will be called How the Wealthy Decorate, or the lunch menus at local lunch restaurants. And the best part is I don't have to write a thing. All I have to do is collect about 200 pretty standard contact reports from organizations around the world, and I will get a wealth of information that has little to do with prospect interest and capacity, but will tell me what the inside of a living room or an office looks like, or what people ordered for lunch. This may sound like I'm exaggerating, but I want to take you through 4 major categories of what I would call the 4 main reasons, the 4 main things that are wrong with contact reports. And then we can talk about solutions. First, they're about the gift officer and not the prospect. Every one of the quotes that you're seeing here was lifted basically word for word. I tried to be true to the context, meaning that it didn't go on to say something useful at actual client sites in many environments. The first, a personal favorite, the sun was in my eyes at lunch, so it was very hard to make eye contact. So gift officer training moment, don't sit in the sun or move if absolutely necessary. She told me that she loved my outfit, which meant a lot to me because she is someone I admire, which is really not about the prospect. This was a great one. I had a very difficult time getting my rental car, and when I got to my hotel, they only had smoking rooms, so I had to find another hotel, and this was all very stressful. All 3 meetings the next day were fine. And then that same paragraph was cut and pasted into each of the 3 contact reports from that day of visits. We know nothing about how the conversations went, what they talked about, even where they were, but we do know that getting a non-smoking hotel room in this particular town can be a challenge at certain times of the year. The last one, I told the prospect about the chemistry lab and the plans that the dean has for the building, and then talking about the reunion. This was about what the gift officer said, not what the prospect said in response. Either one of these sentences is a good start to a contact report, that we talked about the chemistry lab, but what we really need to hear is what was their reaction to the dean's plans for use of the building, and that wasn't recorded. Number 2, they're about irrelevant things. These really get better as we go through them. The menu is a particular favorite of mine. For lunch, I ordered the Cobb salad, and he ordered a panini with smoked turkey, Gouda, spring greens, and a dressing of slivered almonds, craisins, and a mustard vinaigrette, which, given that it's lunchtime for many of you, sounds great, frankly. That's a really enormous amount of detail that serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever from a fundraising perspective. Their driveway was paved with bricks. I don't know what to do with that one. The irrelevance of interpretation, probably in the next two. He was the executive producer of a particular TV show, but it was weird because I didn't think his TV was very big. This assumes that he had only one TV, and it was the one in the room they were meeting, and that TV size is important in this scenario. The landscapers were in the yard, so I assume she must like gardening. As a chief development officer pointed out as we looked at this one, it may also indicate the exact opposite, which she may hate gardening, which is why she has landscapers. They have two cats. Pets make a disproportionate share of appearances in contact reports. Useful if you're going to refer back to it. So again, any of these things could be potentially meaningful under certain circumstances, but as standalones, as these were in most cases, there's not a whole lot of strategic thinking. The inappropriate comments that make their way into contact reports are disconcerting sometimes. For Motion Picture Association rating purposes, I was unable to put in some of the very best inappropriate comments, but you can imagine. He's on his third wife. That's probably useful information under certain circumstances. But his current wife is much younger than him and very attractive from what I could see in the pictures. There's a lot of unnecessary detail. And let's remember, most organizations have either internal policies or even legal obligations to share this kind of documentation in Freedom of Information Act requests. It could go to the news media. It could simply be something that a donor wants to see about them. If you don't want them reading it, if you don't want it in the newspaper, it's probably not a great idea to put it into a contact report. The next two, which I will not read to you word for word, get into medical issues that, again, are really only germane if they affect the timing or the content of a future gift. The degenerative arthritis and hip and knee replacement issue is probably useful if we're talking about gifts to orthopedics. The fact that this person golfs is probably useful if that's going to be a component of our cultivation or if there is the upcoming golf tournament. But as a simple piece of information, it's a bit of extraneous detail. For healthcare organizations, you do have to be careful on your source for this, that if a physician or someone internally gave you medical information that you're entering into the record, you have to make sure that your documentation of that complies with HIPAA rules. Now, the last one I think is really informative. The first sentence is really pretty terrible. I don't recommend using the term jerk in most contact reports. The fact that he was late is not that important, but then read the last sentence, which is almost given as an afterthought. That in most organizations, you're talking about somebody who just said they wanted to talk to the chancellor about between $3 and $4 million worth of gifts for a very specific purpose in a specific part of the organization. And the contact report then didn't get into next steps, didn't talk about how we're going to engage the chancellor on this, and frankly, could have just left out the first two sentences. Some of them are truly nonsense. My all-time favorite contact report ever is the first one here. I ran into Ms. Prospect at the Piggly Wiggly, which is a grocery store chain in the South, if you're not familiar. She wasn't hurt because I only backed into her cart. If you read between the lines here, she literally ran into the Prospect in the parking lot of the Piggly Wiggly with her car and entered that as a contact report. Sorry, I have to recover briefly. It's funny every time. The subject line of a contact report, I met Chuck in his office on 1/15, and the text of the contact report was on January 15th, I met Chuck in his office. The third one, you can tell what's going on. There was a required field in the system. You had to enter something to get to the next screen, so they typed, "This is a contact report." That was all it said. And then the last one, which looks like a mistake if you first read it, if you look carefully, it's exactly the keys that get pressed if you just jam your fingers down on the center row of the keyboard. And someone was just filling the space. They were creating a occupied field so that they could move on to the next screen. Clearly, this was an organization that didn't take contact reports seriously, which simply means they weren't being used. That people didn't understand their value value, and they weren't applying that information in a way that was strategic. So with those aside, and I hope you found that mildly entertaining, and hopefully didn't recognize too many of those issues in your own contact reports, although I'm willing to bet in your own writing and reading of them, you do come across all kinds of interesting comments. There are reasons that contact reports take those forms and why they ultimately don't give us the strategic information that we require. The single biggest, in my view, is that there's no training and no expectation. Many gift officers really don't know what they're supposed to write. They're given a blank field, they're told contact reports are required, but it's not totally clear what data is critical, who's going to read it, and how it's going to be used. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. And the last several slides may lead you to believe that I'm having a good time mocking the frontline gift officers, but I don't actually feel that way. I think that there's really understandable reasons why contact reports are often weak, and if I'm going to give anybody a hard time in this particular context, it's management. It's development and advancement management that don't set clear expectations, and in many cases, your development manager became your manager because they were a good development officer. They were inherently good at asking the right questions and understanding how to distill it into data that they could use to make strategic decisions. And because that was almost second nature to many of them, it's hard to understand that people would need training, that they need a template, and that they need guidance. And the fact is, it just doesn't come naturally to all of us. You may be a terrific face-to-face gift officer, a solid closer, really understand your organization's case for support. But that doesn't mean that you know how to sit down in front of a screen and succinctly say what's necessary for the rest of the organization to know about this particular prospect interaction. Related to that, another reason contact reports will be weak is that very few people read them. If you're the only person who ever is going to go back and read these, some very brief notes that jog your memory or just literally checking the box to get the piece of information in there is a common result. If it's not used, there's no reason for you to take the time necessary to put together a good contact report. And then even if somebody else reads them, there's not often a lot of feedback. So I find in many organizations, there is someone in prospect research, prospect management, some part of the infrastructure that in fact does read contact reports as they come in, but it doesn't necessarily lead to changes in the database, to discussions about next steps. As I said, it becomes an administrative or bureaucratic responsibility where people are going to do it as quickly and as expeditiously, which does not mean efficiently, as they can, so they can move on to the next thing. It's hard to write something compelling from the rental car bus on the way back to the airport. It's hard to write something that is insightful 5 days after your meeting when you've had 13 other meetings between the one you're writing about the contact report and the moment you sit down. The grainy screenshot is from a razor's edge contact report field. Before you even get to the contact report, this requires no fewer than 11 individual steps. I'm not in this particular call going to address how the screen should look or how simplistic or not simplistic it should be, but I think we have to recognize, especially if you have control over the display issues, that gift officers are often doing this in adverse circumstances. It's not necessarily at their desk when they've cleared 2 hours to do this in a thoughtful way. And we also have to be clear about which pieces of information are really necessary. Making all the fields required doesn't necessarily get you the best information. We conducted a series of surveys of donors, in this case all donors who had made gifts of $25,000 or more as part of a campaign. There are 933 respondents in this data set that you're seeing. And the results were interesting. The first two bars are, by the way, they add to more than 100 because people could say there were one or two influential people in making their gift decision. The first two bars are great for showing university leadership and faculty or research staff how important they are to this process. This is not the topic of today's discussion, but the fact is, without leadership being involved in the fundraising process, it's harder to raise larger sums of money. What I, of course, want to focus on is the potentially terrifying finding that only a little over 1% of these 1,000 major gift donors said that someone in the university development office was influential in their decision to make a gift. The first response is, are we really that unimportant to the process? But as we dug into it, looked at other questions in the survey, read the individual comments, it became very clear that it wasn't a question of importance or criticality. It was, again, that word influential being important. Donors viewed gift officers as brokers. You were connecting their interests and resources to programs that needed those resources. And in the same way that we might not say that your real estate agent was influential in your decision to buying a house, they were still probably fundamentally important to the fact that you made that decision. The worst reason of all is that nothing happened, that it was an empty meeting, that there was some discussion. We didn't get at the features that we need to understand as fundraising organizations. The reason there's not much content in the contact report is because not much was discussed. There are a lot of things organizations can do to improve contact reports, which then, of course, allows us to make use of them. It's easy to say we should create accountability. It's harder to do it. What you're seeing on the screen is an example from a fairly large organization, but I don't think that should prevent smaller organizations from thinking this way, was creating a 100-point score at the prospect level. So if Dan Lohman is a record in your database and I'm managed by a gift officer, I would have 35 points attached to my record if there had been a face-to-face visit between a gift officer and me in the last 6 months. And then you can see additional point values for other interactions, an approved contact report for each interaction, approved meaning somebody read it and said it makes sense. A documented prospect strategy, which I'm going to show you an example of in just a minute, that's not out of date and has been approved by management in the last year. There's an entered estimated solicitation date, and that date is in the future. An estimated ask amount that's been approved, it's been approved within the last 12 months, and that the next step is populated and is in the future. I was working at a public university recently, and we pulled a list of the top 200 prospects for the last year of a campaign by the date of the entered next step. And 191 of the 200 had next steps that were in the past. Now, that doesn't mean nothing's happening, but it means that the leadership of this organization had absolutely no ability to forecast activity and to quickly get an understanding of how, frankly, 90% of the big gifts that would close out this campaign were going to come in. Now, of course, many of them did come in. There was lots of activity, but there was no ability to be thoughtful about it or track it or look at it holistically. What you can do with a score like this is, first of all, it helps to create an accountability, because if gift officers and their managers are looking at records in your portfolio that are scored at less than 100 or set a threshold somewhere at less than 90, at less than 80, you can go back and look to see what's missing. So if we agree that these 7 items are important to do and have documented, it gives you a way to not have to review every record all the time, but only look for the ones that appear to have critical gaps. At a more holistic level, you can score an entire portfolio. So if a gift officer on average only has a score of 65 for the prospects in their portfolio, and the average of all the gift officers is 92, that gives you, as a manager, a moment to intervene and start to think about what the issue is. Are we not having the visits? Are we not recording the visits? Are we not documenting the information that we may need? In a moment, literally one slide, I want to show you a template for what we believe is a good guide to creating a good contact report. But ultimately, this comes back to giving some direction. If we present staff with a blank field in a database or a blank blinking cursor in a Word document and say, fill out the contact report, there's no telling what you'll get. And that doesn't mean that there's any laziness or malfeasance involved. It means we haven't given any guidance, so we can't really expect things to turn out a certain way. And within this template where we can guide frontline development staff to give us information that will help us make future decisions, we can also then flag changes. So we have a mechanism to tell prospect research staff, prospect management staff, development leadership, research and records that there's new information that needs to be taken into account. This goes on for 3 pages, and I will not read each item to you individually. But over the last couple of years, some of my colleagues and I have spent some time thinking about what do we really want to know as the outcome of a face-to-face interaction with a prospect. So we get at what are probably fairly obvious, but they become a lot more obvious when you ask it this way. You know, what was the purpose for the meeting, and what was the prospect's understanding of the purpose? Which may be different. You may have been going to try to qualify the prospect for major gift capability. Their understanding may have been that it was to talk about the 30th reunion planning process. What did you learn during the interaction that would cause you to maintain or reevaluate the potential financial capacity of the prospect? What did you see? What was the visual bling or the audio bling or the information that was derived that gave you a sense of this prospect's capability? And if it's different from what you thought going in, this is the moment to change it. What did you learn that will inform our understanding of the prospect's interest in specific programs? So this is where we could start to document they're interested in scholarships, that they're interested in research. You may not know the answer in many cases, and that's okay. As you see, as this goes on with more and more questions of, is there a planned giving opportunity? Are there other people on campus or in the organization that we need to bring into this discussion? For example, if they said, I really want to talk to the dean about X, we need to then get the dean involved if that prospect is at a level that's appropriate for that kind of interaction. And in cases where you don't have the information, this also helps you to frame what needs to happen next. Do we need more research to understand family relationships or financial capacity? Do we need to talk to the treating physician about their particular interest in a medical research area? Any of those kinds of things, this presents the opportunity to frame up what do we need to do in our next visit, what do we need to do for a next step. A lot of organizations, maybe not a lot, many organizations have begun to take these kinds of templates and make them the actual contact report vehicle in the database system. So if you have a system that allows that kind of flexibility, this can actually happen right in the donor management system. Other places have used a PDF template or an Excel template where you enter the information and it can be captured automatically and loaded into fields within the system. Even if you're running a fairly lean technical infrastructure, having this, even if it's just a Word document or a PDF where you're writing down the answers to these specific questions, we find to be an outstanding framework for garnering the information that you need, organizing it in ways we can refer back to, and helping gift officers mature in their own ability to be good gift officers by thinking about what questions do we need to ask or what do we need to observe in order to answer one of these questions. And to put it in very blunt terms, because at this point, seeing 3 pages with 12 blank fields, a common response that I encounter is, I don't have time to enter all that information. And my only response to that can be, if you do 150 visits a year, which would put you toward the high end of what high-performing gift officers do, and each one of those meetings were to take 2 hours, which may be generous, that's 300 hours of face-to-face time that you've spent. And if we then put an hour after each one of those meetings to do a very thorough and thoughtful job in filling out a contact report like this, which is probably also generous, you're talking about 450 hours a year out of roughly 2,000 to 2,400 hours that full-time people work in a year. It's hard for me to imagine that we could say on the one hand that face-to-face visits with prospects are the most important thing we can do as fundraisers, and then on the other say we don't have time to write down what happened and be thoughtful about our next steps. I think you have to make the time, and if that's an hour per prospect per visit, I think that that's time really well spent. Contact reports on their own are the basis for all of this. It's where we collect the information that we can then use for these strategic decisions. It is helpful to also have a separate, more high-level document that we might think of as a prospect strategy template that works together with the contact reports, where we're trying to summarize at what level right now, based on everything we know, where do we think this prospect could come in as a donor. That doesn't mean we're talking to Bill Gates and he could give $1 billion. That's not what we're asking. We're saying, how much do you think is plausible based on what we know? That may change. And then the same kinds of questions about their likelihood to do it, their specific area of interest or that we don't know, or that it could be unrestricted. The timing and who else needs to be involved in this discussion. And I'm going to show you an example of this, and then I want to talk a little bit about some potential modifications to a traditional prospect management operation that may help implement some of these things in certain environments. So what's on the screen here, and I should mention the actual documents here will be available for download. You'll get an email about that soon, so you can actually have these in print form. So this is a document that is basically lifted wholesale from a university organization. And it's a Word document. This is not complex. This does not go on for pages and pages, but it has been implemented as a required document that needs to be entered at the time that you schedule or conduct your first visit, and then gets continuously updated, generally after every other visit, but also, in theory, if other substantial information has emerged. And it's simply asking for some basic information to lay out for the gift officer's own thinking and planning and for their manager's ability to understand where we're going with this prospect, where help may be required. And in this particular organization, with a member of a research and prospect management team that's responsible for helping facilitate many of these things. So if there is a need for more research, or if there's a need for a business phone number, or if there's a need to get on the schedule with the CEO of the hospital, that information can be captured, someone can act on it, it can be distributed around to everyone from the administrative staff through the senior leadership of the advancement operation. Some organizations have begun to shift some responsibilities that now often exist in several different places into something of a central position that, just because I like the word PIM, we could call a prospect information manager. This role already exists in a lot of cases under names that fall into a lot of categories. In some cases, it's the development assistant. In some cases, it's a prospect research manager. They fall all over the place. But the idea is creating a staff position that's really responsible for understanding all the data about prospects that are in portfolios. That can mean certainly traditional research, and this does not replace the prospect research analyst in terms of understanding the complexities of all the things that we can pull from external research. but being really a kind of partner, a supportive partner in thinking about next steps. And therefore, it also creates a person to read these contact reports. There's now an audience. If someone answers the question, we had rated the question about financial capacity in the contact report, saying I thought this was maybe a $25,000 to $50,000 prospect, but after understanding more about their business and family wealth, I now think that this is potentially a $100,000 to $250,000 prospect or whatever. This now creates a place where you can have a conversation about what does that mean in terms of next steps, what does that mean about getting the database up to date, and in fact, this role was born out of medical institutions' observations that their prospect management meetings were largely spent saying, that report's not right, that piece of data is not right. It says I haven't visited that person, but I actually visited them twice last month, it's just not in the system yet. By creating this infrastructure, we can get all this stuff up to date in one-on-one meetings before sitting down with a larger group or with development leadership to talk about where the challenges emerge, where help is needed, where important news is important to convey. In the absence of a formal prospect information management model, at a minimum, my recommendation would be for any gift officer to sit down with their manager and ideally some somewhat neutral third party, such as somebody from the research office, to review contact reports. The form that this often takes is running a report of all prospects in a portfolio and focusing on those that have a next step that's coming up in the next 30 days, and then focusing on those that haven't had any face-to-face contact in, say, 6 months or 9 months. We don't have to talk about all 125 prospects that are in the file, but we can talk about those where there's something critical coming up that requires attention and observation. Or simply saying, we've decided this is a good prospect, we know we want to manage them, we have not yet gotten to having the face-to-face visit we wanted to have, but making sure that discussion happens, say, every month or every quarter, so we don't lose sight of those prospects. It's one of the hardest things to see in prospect management reports is the number of managed prospects that have had no face-to-face contact in 12 months or 24 months. If you're not thinking about them, there's a reasonably good chance they're not thinking about you, and ultimately it's our responsibility to make sure that they have that level of attention. Using the contact report template and the prospect strategy document, what this new prospect management meeting, which as differentiated from the old prospect management meeting, which is the entire department going around the table and reciting their Outlook calendar, we can now have a small group that is focused on reviewing recently visited prospects and making sure that the 7 key questions that I'll show you on the next slide have been answered about those prospects. Reviewing prospects that are coming up on what's described here as a stage deadline if you use prospect management stages, or simply can be prospects who haven't been contacted in X amount of time. So even if you don't use stages, you can still use the calendar as a way to set this meeting. If applicable, who are new names that we want to evaluate for potential inclusion in a portfolio? And I'll put that in the context of organizations that have recently done a screening or predictive modeling project. Those projects may result in hundreds or thousands of potentially interesting names. And we'll be the first to tell you that getting a third-party consulting firm to hand you a list of 3,000 potentially good names is almost as useless as not getting any names or saying all 400,000 prospects in your database are potentially good prospects could be something you can use. We got to look at this in terms of our ability to get at names. If that means 3 names per gift officer per meeting as a way to review them to say, yes, I want to put this person in my portfolio, or here's a reason this person should definitely not be in a portfolio, that small number is fine, but it's got to be laid out in a timeline so that we can address that systematically so 3,000 names doesn't become an immovable object. The last bullet point here, which which says ideas. I'm a fan of management approval for new assignments and management approval for disqualifications. I don't mean this as a bureaucratic checkbox exercise. I think it's useful for fundraisers to have to talk to somebody about why they want to take a prospect on or why they want to move a prospect out, because that other person may have really good points of view on maybe there's some other things we can try, or maybe this isn't the best use of our time right now. No matter how good our intentions or how talented we may be as frontline fundraisers, just having what may be a mirror that you're talking to in the form of a colleague can be very valuable in helping frame out why I think I should get in the car and go see this person, or why have I decided this is not worth the institution's resources from a development perspective. So the 7 key questions, which are in some ways a short form of the contact report questions, which you remember has 12. But my recommendation here is that after every meaningful interaction with a prospect, it's useful to take a moment and see if you can answer these 7 questions. What's a realistic solicitation level for this prospect? By consensus rating, I mean you have your opinion as the gift officer who met this person. The president of the university came back from the golf course and said, you've got to talk to this lady, she's worth billions. You've got a research office that says, based on the information they found, our rating would say $100,000. You may have a wealth screening result that says $25,000. We've got to come up with the number for you. At this stage, based on what we know, make your very best educated guess, which should get more and more accurate as we get closer to a proposal. But on day one, before we go see somebody, we should be able to say, based on a Google search and DonorScape data, I think that we're talking about somebody with at least $25,000 in capacity, or whatever the number is. I think it's important to be able to say that so that we don't do too many discovery visits that aren't with people who could even consider making these gifts. Has the definition for a new stage been met, or alternatively, where are we with this prospect? What level of connection do we have? Where are we in a donor pipeline or continuum? Has anything that would happen to cause us to reevaluate the stage or the rating or the estimated solicitation date? You'd hope after most face-to-face visits, at least one of these things would change or be firmed up. If we come away with a visit unable to say, well, we've moved from advanced cultivation to ready to solicit, or we've been talking about a $25,000 gift for a year, and now I think that's either a higher, lower, or same number, or we're ready to do this. I think that by July 25th, we'll be in a position to make a solicitation. Those are why we do visits, one of the reasons at least, and being able to reconfirm that is critical. Interest areas, let me skip over number 5 for 1 second. Do we need to communicate any of this to anyone else, and what is our immediate next step? Those, I hope, are straightforward. Number 5, is there a planned giving opportunity? This one's just too easy to miss. Every prospect has some potential for a deferred gift or a planned gift. That doesn't mean that we want to raise it now. It doesn't mean that we will ever raise a deferred giving opportunity with this prospect. But given that many gifts, particularly large gifts, can have deferred components, they can be blended asks, it may make sense to take a major gift prospect or even a prospect in stewardship and introduce them from almost an educational perspective to deferred or complex giving opportunities. Again, I think we want to be able to say either we have a planned gift in place, we have a plan to introduce and cultivate toward a planned gift, or here's the couple sentence reason why this is inappropriate now, so that we don't leave that major piece of financial opportunity uncovered. So a contact report can be used for actual prospect management, the actual process of working with prospects and managing them toward a gift. It helps you evaluate stages and ratings, allows you to plan for next steps. allows you to take managers to take a high-level look at portfolios and where prospects are in the pipeline. If you add up all the estimated solicitation amounts for the next 12 months and it does not equal the amount of money in the goal for that year's fundraising from individuals, that's a problem. And if we can identify that in month 1 of a year instead of month 11 of a year, it allows us to address the prospect pipeline, make sure we're maximizing gifts, and make sure that we're developing relationships to fill the portfolio. You can use a well-done contact report to evaluate visit quality. It's hard to evaluate gift officers on anything other than their material production. And it may be you have a fundraiser that raises a few $1 million a year, which is objectively terrific, but you may find that they're very aggressive or that they could be asking for more than they've been asking for, and that the $2 million actually represents a floor and not a ceiling. A good contact report can help managers in their role as mentors and step in and say, there's some skills development that we can work on here. Or the other way around, you're really good at this particular part of the fundraising process. How can we use you to get other fundraisers educated and more talented in those areas? And I think critically, it makes stewardship visits more important. In our analysis of the data, stewardship visits account for between 1/3 and 1/2 of all visits, which is to say most of the people we visit are already donors at certain levels, and we often position them as, we want to tell you what's going on as a result of your gift, tell you what's going on in the department, and those kinds of other issues. A university on the East Coast, this is a funny joke, by the way, a university on the East Coast was having a campaign for science-related purposes, and they did many of the obvious things, looking at science alums, people who worked in industries related to science and technology, and then they realized, of course, that there were a lot of people who maybe don't work in science or didn't graduate in science who may have interest in science. And they did something that was simple but elegant. They made a list of about 200 words that had something to do with science and with the priorities of this particular part of the campaign. And then realizing they had 50,000 contact reports in their system, 50 with 3 zeros after it, most of which had never been read by anyone other than the person who wrote them. They launched a keyword search and pulled out people who were the word science, research, geology, energy, rocks, minerals, and they pulled out people with journalism degrees that now ran technology companies. They pulled out people with psychology degrees that talked about how they were going on a dig in New Mexico because geology is their passion. They found all kinds of stuff, hundreds of people that had clear interest in science-related topics that wouldn't have come up through other mechanisms, and that was all from the benefit of good contact reports. So the last thing I want to mention is contact reports don't necessarily have to come from totally organic interactions where you go out with a limited agenda, talk a bit, and then try to fill out this questionnaire. What follows here is a brief example of a hospital that had a lot of donors. About 100,000 donors appeared to be sort of over the transom gifts. They had good major gift officers. They knew what to do. They were soliciting at high levels, but as many organizations struggle with, they had some difficulty in qualifying and cultivating colder leads. So what they did was define a small pool, people who appeared to have some capacity and some relationship to the organization in terms of past giving. And they developed a survey. And the idea behind the survey was, let's just go ask people some of these qualification questions. In this case, they outsourced it to a firm that did this over the telephone, but it's also quite common to have gift officers use the survey as a qualification tool. The questions can be framed around the data we're trying to get in a contact report. What kinds of organizations do you support? What were the reasons you made the gift to us that you made, even if it was a direct mail gift? What are your best memories from your time on campus, or of these 8 social service programs we administer, which do you think is the most important? It creates an entry point. It gives structure to the meeting. It helps to train gift officers in how you elicit the information that we can answer in those contact report questions. In the case of this hospital, it generated hundreds of people that were high capacity who said they were very interested and wanted to learn more. What follows, again, you'll be able to get the a printable version of this from the downloadable materials, but a fairly lengthy survey that a university put in place with their alumni. Again, they took people they didn't know real well. They had some evidence of capacity based on external factors like wealth screening, even just zip codes, but also past giving and internal ratings, and sent gift officers out with the charge. The president has asked us to speak with our alumni, our friends, our past donors to help us plan for the future. And this is not a solicitation visit. I'm not going to ask you for money. We want to find out your opinion. And invariably, these types of surveys produce troves of information that we can use from a strategic perspective to organize prospects into various categories and strategic buckets. Also, by themselves, form a substantive contact that often leads to gifts, in some cases, even directly. So you can see this is a lengthy survey. That's my presentation. We have some questions that have come in through the chat piece. Do you want me to address those? Do you want? One question is, we would like to hear more thoughts about what should be considered a contact report aside from a scheduled visit. I'm thinking of phone calls and conversations during events when we stay in touch and keep the organization in the individual's mind. That's a great question. To me, a contact is a contact. A brief interaction at an event can be as valuable as a scheduled face-to-face visit in a predetermined location. Same thing with phone calls, even emails going back and forth. I think it comes back to the 7 key questions, that if you had an interaction that reinforces or changes the answer to any of the 7 key questions, even if it was a 1-sentence email, to me that constitutes a contact from a recording standpoint. From an evaluation standpoint, in terms of asking gift officers to do 150 visits, I do think we have to be clear, or whatever the number is. I think we have to be clear that we mean some number are face-to-face because we recognize the importance of those. Some number are what we might call substantial but not face-to-face interactions, which can be just as valuable, but they need to be counted separately. A second question. Advice for alumni relations professionals who do not have a portfolio but have regular contact with potential prospects. I still believe that a contact report for face-to-face visits for people in advancement are as close to required as we can make them. You're learning information that will inevitably be useful to frontline gift officers down the road, but even for strictly alumni relations applications, who may be a volunteer, who may be a business owner that can support internship programs, who is willing to host events, who's willing to be an advocate for the organization in various ways. I think while the questions may be ultimately different in some cases, or we need to add questions that get at those other types of interactions that are directly relevant to alumni relations, we still need to look at all advancement activity with an eye toward donor potential. And even if you're regularly working with a constituent who may not be a prospect but has connections, or may not be a prospect but is a great volunteer, I think it's important to record your beliefs on that, if for no other reason than we don't start haranguing a great volunteer about making a gift they can't make.
Right, thank you, everybody. I just opened the poll, so if you could please take that before you exit the webinar and give us a little bit of feedback on how we did today, we'd really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.